Should I go to professional school? Should I become a professional? There are many possible meanings of the word professional. In sports, it means you get paid for what you do, okay? But when we talk about professional schools and say that they are law, medicine, architecture, dental school, education, what kind of aim do those things have in common? Business school, too. What might they have in common? What are you going to go out and do in society? Work, yes. We hope. What kind of work? If you're a doctor, who are you going to work for, ultimately? I hope. Who? People, your patients. If you're a lawyer, who are you going to work for? Your clients. If you're a teacher, who are you going to work for? Your students. To me, that's what a professional means. Do you put the interests of yourself or your client first if you are a lawyer? You better put the interests of your client first. If you're in finance, do you put your interests first or the interest of your client? That has become a vexed question in our society. But I would hope that someone who's in finance put the interests of their client first. Otherwise, I might not wish to talk to them about my interests. I just might not trust them. And all professional relationships are built upon a degree of trust. I am doing this for my clients. And that is part of the message of Douglas here in a broader sense. That self-interest is not the highest principle of the country. Now, in the source book, the way David Blight has edited this, and you may not have it in your copy, the narration ends with the paragraph or the statement, "I leave, therefore, the great deeds of your fathers to other gentlemen whose claim to have been regularly descended," meaning you can trace your lineage, "will be less likely to be disputed than mine." Meaning you can listen to people who can say, well, my great-great-grandfather fought in the Revolution, or my uncle's grandfather was at the Battle of Saratoga. Do you see what he's saying? So he leaves off that narration, and then he turns to the present, to the here and now, to what Martin Luther King Jr. called the fierce urgency of now. You've done the narration, and now you're coming up to the present day. My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is the ever-living now. What should we do now? This is one of the great questions of so many rhetorical addresses. All right, this is what we know. This is the situation. What do we do now? He begins to talk, in essence, about the fact that people have forgotten what some of these revolutionaries did, including Washington. What did Washington do with the people he had who were enslaved? He freed them. He freed them. He says, in essence, there is a necessity for self-reflection, but the problem is that people have not listened. He says, such is not the state of the case. I say with a sad sense of the disparity between us. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. And then he has a long paragraph quoting Psalm 137. So he's bringing in, now, therefore he's bringing in a kind of illustration. It's a kind of, remember we talked about non-artistic modes of persuasion. You can bring in texts, you can bring in authorities. He's already brought in the Declaration of Independence. He's brought in biblical language. So he is bringing in these other things by alluding to them. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. This is the great sin and shame of America. So he's now come to the point of talking directly about the current state of slavery. And then he does something very curious. What might you expect someone who opposes slavery to do as an argument? Would you expect them to argue that slaves are people? We talked about the distinction between persons and things. You might expect that, but he doesn't do that. He brings it up to refuse to do it. He brings it up to refuse to do it. Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. He is not going to argue the rightness or wrongness of it. He takes the wrong for granted. Now let's stop for a second here and think about the three types of rhetorical discourse that we discussed last time. There's a lot to keep in mind, but it's really not all that complicated. I would contend it's less complicated than multivariable calculus. I think so. You grasp it. Three types of rhetoric. Is this ceremonial rhetoric? Does it take place on a ceremonial occasion of some kind? Yes, although it puts a twist to that. So it is ceremonial. Is it deliberative? Is he trying to argue something that should be done? Actually, it is too. It is deliberative. Is it forensic in any way to say that something is wrong and something is right? Yes, it's that too. This is a remarkable address because it actually has within its confines those three major types of rhetoric. It is forensic. Later on in the address, he points an accusatory finger at the church in the United States because they have silently supported slavery in a hypocritical fashion. A point that will later be echoed by Martin Luther King Jr. in his famous letter from Birmingham jail. And that letter is addressed to religious leaders in essence. To say, I am in jail because I refuse to obey a law which I consider to be unjust. And you as a religious leader should pay attention to that, instead of acquiescing to a system that is unjust. Now you have to pay a price for it. He's in jail. He paid a greater price. It takes courage. But as Aristotle said, courage is a really important virtue, because without it, you can't exercise the others. So, he is making an accusation against the entire system in the country of slavery. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is a moral, intellectual, and responsible being? He's not going to undertake the argument that a slave is a human being. No. And then he talks about the internal slave trade. This is remarkable because what had happened to the African slave trade in the United States by this time? It's outlawed, right? So slavery has an internal slave trade. And that internal slave trade has been able to keep slavery alive, alas. And if you look, I think it's probably about halfway through the address, there is a paragraph that begins, "Behold the practical operation of this internal slave trade, the American slave trade, sustained by American politics and American religion. Here you will see men and women reared like swine for the market." They are bred like domesticated animals for the market. And then he turns and he envisions a scene. Now this is another rhetorical move. Douglas is good at it. Technical name, you don't need to remember, but it's called enargia. It means creating a theatrical-like scene in the mind's eye of the hearer. Mark the sad procession as it moves wearily along, and the inhuman wretch who drives them. Hear his savage yells and his blood-chilling oaths as he hurries on his affrighted captives. There see the old man with locks thinned and gray. Cast one glance, if you please, upon that young mother whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun, her briny tears falling on the brow of the babe in her arms. See too that girl of 13, weeping, yes, weeping, as she thinks of the mother from whom she has been torn. You can continue to read that passage. It's kind of a set scene. What artistic means of persuasion is he using here? He's using pathos, absolutely. It's an emotional appeal. But then he adds something very special to that. In the very next paragraph, he says, I was born amid such sights and scenes. Now, that's not so much pathos as ethos, yes, and it's something else, too. It's one of the non-artistic means of persuasion, which is witness. I saw it. I was there. I know this. I can testify to it. To me, the slave trade is a terrible reality. He then goes a little farther on to say, you know, it would be one thing if the slave trade were just in the South, but this is 1852. And what had happened 2 years before?
The Compromise of 1850?
Yes, and the Compromise of 1850 produced what along with it? The Fugitive Slave Law. The Fugitive Slave Law was a law that basically said that any slave who was owned by anyone, anywhere in the United States, should be apprehended. And it was the duty of every citizen to help do so. So even if you lived in a state like Massachusetts, which had had slavery be illegal since the 1780s, and you're a resident of Massachusetts, what are you supposed to do if there's an escaped slave from Virginia up here? You're supposed to help cut that person. And this was shocking to people, but it was a federal law. It was a federal law. And so, Douglas says, by that act, the Mason and Dixon line has been obliterated, and New York become as Virginia. In other words, if you think that you in the so-called free states are now free from slavery, you are not. It's one of the reasons why in the House Divided speech, Lincoln will say he believes the Union will become either all slave or all free. There are some other factors that Lincoln adds to it, but the Fugitive Slave Law is one. Dred Scott decision is another. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is another. We'll talk about that when we come to the House Divided speech. So he says, your law, your president, your Secretary of State, your lords nobles, that's an ironic thing. We don't have lords and nobles, but he's using it ironically, meaning the powerful people in the country, and ecclesiastics. What are ecclesiastics? What does that mean? Church. Yeah, members of a church, yes. He's not speaking of a specific church here, just members of churches. Enforce as a duty you owe to your free and glorious country and to your God that you do this accursed thing. You are under obligation of law to help slavery out. Now, there were some people in the North who didn't do that. So if you go to Warren House, you know where Warren House is? It's near Barker Center. You go to Warren House and you poke around there and you will discover that there's a chamber that the Underground Railway used. And people who were escaping hid there on their way to Canada. Because after the Fugitive Slave Law, they could no longer be assured of being free anywhere in the United States. And of course, Douglas then says, and turns in a very powerful way, to the fact, something he's been hinting all along, that this is really against religious principles that people profess. And the church is responsible as much as anyone else. He says, for my part, I would say, welcome infidelity, welcome atheism, welcome anything in preference to the gospel as preached by those divines. This is fairly strong stuff. I mean, you know, I'm not sure. What do you think would happen if you went out in the middle of Harvard Square today and said, I'm an atheist? Maybe nothing, exactly, not in Harvard Square. Other places in the country, you might get a reaction. If you say, welcome blasphemy, welcome atheism, this is fairly shocking. But Douglas believes it so deeply, they convert the very name of religion into an engine of tyranny. There's that phrase, engine of tyranny, again, almost lifted right out of Isaac Backus's speech. No, he says, your hands are full of blood. That is his phrase. If you, as religious figures, support this system, your hands are full of blood. In prosecuting the anti-slavery enterprise, we have been asked to spare the church and spare the ministry. And this begins a kind of refutation. In other words, people say, well, we're just following the law. It's the fugitive slave law. It's been passed. We should follow it. We're not going to rock the boat. And he goes after this defense. And he says, your hands are full of blood. You invite to your shores fugitives of oppression from abroad. You glory in your refinement and your universal education. Yet you maintain a system as barbarous and as dreadful as ever stained the character of a nation. You shed tears over fallen Hungary in Europe and make the sad story of her wrongs the theme of your poets, statesmen, and orators. But in regard to the 10,000 wrongs of the American slave, you would enforce the strictest silence. And that whole passage where he says, you do this on behalf of liberty, but here you do that, is essentially a kind of refutation of the supposed well-meaning cries of liberty and freedom, especially from the church. And then he comes to a section which in the copy in the source book is headed simply the Constitution. And he says something absolutely remarkable about it. Not only that the Constitution does not contain a word about slavery as such, it does not make slavery lawful as such. That point is fairly clear. But there is going to be an argument over the interpretation of the Constitution, as there almost always is when it comes to slavery. Can we argue over the Constitution? Yes. Do we? Yes, we do. Thank goodness we can, and we do. Does our argument always win out? No. But here is a remarkable thing that Douglas says. I hold that every American citizen has a right to form an opinion of the Constitution and to propagate that opinion and to use all honorable means to make his opinion the prevailing one. This is a terrifically emancipatory statement. Does that mean that your opinion will become the prevailing one? No. Does it mean you have the opportunity to try to make it so? Yes. But what kind of means do you have to use, does he say? It's that very interesting adjective. Honorable, yes. And what might you think would be a dishonorable means?
Lying, perhaps, or like...
Well, lying seems pretty dishonorable, yes. I think that's probably not very good. What else might be dishonorable? Bribery? Bribe a judge? Tamper with a jury? That seems dishonorable, right? Violence, is that acceptable? Promulgating violence to change the attitude of people, being a provocateur, that doesn't seem very honorable. There are dishonorable means by which one can try to sway. And Douglas is saying, as long as you use honorable means, you can try to get an interpretation of the Constitution to prevail. We are still living with that, and we will continue to live with it. And I would say, thank goodness. Because without that, then there will be some other authority other than argument and persuasion and the sovereignty of the people. How does the Constitution begin, the preamble? We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Right there, it's a constitutional tie today. We the people. Taken from the old Roman Republic, SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanum, the people and the Senate of Rome. So it's an echo of the old Roman Republic, not the empire. And then Douglas concludes his address with some poetry and song. If you go back over this address, you will note that it contains an enormous amount of learning and erudition. It could really be written and delivered only by someone with a liberal education in the arts and sciences. I believe that to be true. And near the end of the address, you will notice that he envisions a globalized world with people traveling and freely moving throughout the globe in a state of freedom. How long ago? 1852? It's a long time. The civil rights movement in some respects is still not over. That's the last thing I wanted to say today. Bacchus gave his speech when? 1788? 1852? These things take time. That's why the second title of the first unit is called A Long Struggle. Perhaps they ought not to take a long time, but any significant change in a society, even affected by revolutionary means, takes a long time. It is something that means we have to learn patience with courage. Here's what W.E.B. Du Bois says at the ends of the souls of black folk. All this means time and development. It comes not complete by instant revolution of a day, not yet by the deferred evolution of 1,000 years. It comes daily, bit by bit, step by step, as men and women learn and grow, and as children are trained in truth. In other words, whatever struggle is worth putting yourself into may very likely be a struggle that will still have to be fought after you have passed away. Now that takes courage to commit yourself to it.